Thank you so much. That was lovely. Okay, now for the program. We all know Pastor John Morgan, our minister here at Williamsburg Presbyterian Church. But I bet you didn't know Pastor John was predestined to speak to us today on revolution from the pulpit. As good Presbyterians, we all love a good predestination joke. But in John's case, the American Revolution truly has followed him his entire life. For starters, John hails from Philadelphia, the home of the Liberty Bell and Independence Hall. He grew up near the Delaware River, where they still reenact Washington's crossing every Christmas. He earned his master's from Princeton Theological Seminary. Fun fact, Princeton's sixth president was the only clergyman to sign the Declaration of Independence. Talk about high expectations for a graduate. By the way, he also holds a doctorate from McCormick Theological Seminary in Chicago, just in case Princeton wasn't enough academic pressure. John has preached all over the country, including York, Pennsylvania, which served as a temporary U.S. capital during the Revolutionary War. Finally, in 2013, his revolutionary tour of duty brought him right here to our historic colonial capital of Williamsburg. So was this all predestined? Well, John was practically born into a church pew. When he arrived in this world, his father was in a Presbyterian seminary. Later, he married Ellen, whose father was also a Presbyterian minister. So yes, his fate was sealed from day one. Now, I want to share a little secret he might not want you to know. In high school, John marched in Philadelphia's famous New Year's Day Mummers Parade. No, he didn't wear sequins or feathers, sadly, but he did play the trumpet. Yes, the trumpet. He describes it as a cross between a French horn and a trumpet. But I think it sounds like a fictional character in a Dr. Seuss, or a fictional instrument from a Dr. Seuss book. But it's time to leave the trumpet behind and let Pastor John tell his story in his own words. Please join me in welcoming Pastor John Morgan.
Well, it's wonderful to be with you here today and to share this passion of mine that came out of my sabbatical. And really, I did a lot of work on this with my sabbatical, and so it was a joy to be able to share that with you. And as we've already heard, what led me to this connection to colonial churches, I started way back with my father, but also when my father was an associate pastor at Neshaminy Warwick Presbyterian Church in Bucks County. Matt is smiling over there. Bucks County, Pennsylvania. That was a church founded by William Tennant. Reverend William Tennant started this log college, which was the very first Presbyterian theological seminary serving Presbyterians in 1727. In 1739, Log College alumni Samuel Blair, Samuel Finney, Gilbert Tennant, and William Tennant Jr. would become among the first trustees of the newly formed College of New Jersey, later to be named Princeton University. And Matt Slack, you may not know a little known fact of it, he is a descendant of William Tennant. So he loves this topic as well. I did go to Princeton Theological Seminary and Princeton for my Master's of Divinity. John Witherspoon, as already been mentioned, was the revolutionary pastor who signed the Declaration of Independence and was the sixth president of the College of New Jersey. There's a statue of him on campus at Princeton with the inscription, Patriot, Preacher, President. My first call to ministry was to First Presbyterian Church in Caldwell, New Jersey. The town was named after Reverend James Caldwell, who left his pulpit to fight in the Revolutionary War. The middle school mascot in Caldwell is the Fighting Parsons. Caldwell was actually from Virginia. He was born in Charlotte County, Virginia. His father was one who was given permission to preach as a dissenting minister in Virginia. Caldwell graduated from Princeton in 1759. He was a pastor in Elizabeth, New Jersey. And on April 1st, 1776, he became chaplain of the 3rd New Jersey Battalion. The British put a bounty on his head, and in January 1780, they burned his home and his church to the ground. On June 7th, a redcoat shot his wife Hannah through the window of their home. Then they drug her body outside, set fire to the house. Neighbors saved the children. But after burying his wife's body, he placed his children in the care of parishioners and rushed back to join the army. At the Battle of Springfield, soldiers in his battalion ran out of wadding for their guns. Caldwell, as pictured here, went into the Presbyterian church, grabbed armloads of hymnals written by Isaac Watts, and gave them to the soldiers, shouting, "Give 'em Watts, boys, give 'em Watts." On November 24th, 1781, 15 months after the battle, he went to the Elizabethtown Point to assist a woman who was arriving by boat. As he was leaving the vessel, a guard ordered him to stop. He did, and the guard shot him anyway. Many said that the guard, James Morgan, had been bribed by the British to shoot him, and Morgan was tried and hung. In 1999, I was then called to the First Presbyterian Church in York, Pennsylvania. This is a picture of the reconstructed courthouse in York, Pennsylvania. It was where the Continental Congress met to write and adopt the Articles of Confederation of the United States of America. John Witherspoon was a delegate from New Jersey and led the one state, one vote debate against John Adams, who wanted votes proportional to the state's population. One of the other signers of the Declaration of Independence, an organizer of the Army in Pennsylvania, was Colonel James Smith. He was a lawyer and a member of the Presbyterian Church in York. I imagine Mr. Smith inviting Reverend Witherspoon to join him at worship while the Congress was in town. Every year, as I was pastor there, I said a prayer at the grave of James Smith in the churchyard with the James Smith chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution. On November 15, 1777, the Articles were adopted in York, and the Congress did its business from the courthouse until 1778. In York, there's a history book entitled Crucible of a New Nation, and it says that, quote, "the national capital in the town of York, Pennsylvania, which on the same basis lays just and lasting claim to the title, the first capital of the United States." There was a sense of pride, very much, for the Yorkers, and also a great debate for New Yorkers who claimed that they were the first capital in New York in 1789 when the Constitution was ratified and George Washington was inaugurated. Well, as you know, in 2013, I was called to Williamsburg, in many ways the birthplace of our nation, and an interpreter of colonial life in our living museum. Of course, you may know, or maybe not, I'm surprised how many people don't realize the Presbyterian Meeting House that's down by Christine Campbell's tavern. And if you go in there, it tells the story of the Presbyterians. And that was actually funded by our Presbyterian Foundation that put that together. And so it's wonderful to have that here. So next time you're way down the other end, past the Capitol, go inside this little meeting house, which was recreated to display where Presbyterians met. Although Williamsburg was dominated by the Church of England, Lewis Weeks, we all know, in an article for the Presbyterian Historical Society, makes a case that Reverend Robert Hunt the chaplain of the London company that came to Jamestown on the Goodspeed, Discovery and Susan Constant, was part of the Presbyterian movement in England and the first clergy to offer prayer and worship in Virginia. Interestingly, Spencer McBride notes that, quote, the Virginia Company, in an attempt to differentiate its goals of wealth from those of the Spanish colonies in North America, attempted to persuade would-be colonists reading its pamphlets that by moving to Virginia, they would be fulfilling England's providential mission of spreading Protestantism to the Americas and protecting Native Americans from the cruelty and false religion of Catholic Spain. I'm not sure we protected them all that well. So we do know that Presbyterian minister Reverend Francis McCamey came to the eastern shore of Virginia and is seen very much as the father of Presbyterianism in the colonies. Christopher Pearl wrote that in the Journal of Presbyterian History that Presbyterian clergy played an important role in America's founding by providing their congregants with the crucial political and religious ideas that served as guiding sentiment of the Revolution. Published and unpublished sermons of Presbyterian ministers with congregations throughout the 13 colonies show that clergy embraced and expounded Enlightenment principles that informed revolutionaries as they declared independence from Britain. From the pulpit, ministers schooled their congregation about the state of nature, natural law, the origins of civil society, and the role and purposes of government. Importantly, they even taught their flocks the limits of obedience and the right to resistance, even revolution. Just a little bit of glare here. I'm going to try to get rid of that. If I keep that a little bit better. Then I lost my place. Hold on a second. Okay, here we are. The Scottish Enlightenment and its philosophy, I think, were also critical in promoting revolution and creating a separate government. Witherspoon was influenced by it and also had a passionate evangelical fervor. One tenet of the Enlightenment was natural law. Pearl writes, at the creation, ministers argued, God established a known law, God's law, which outlined the individual's social responsibilities to the larger community to ensure happiness and safety for everyone. During my sabbatical time in colonial Williamsburg, I went to the Nation Builders lecture given by Reverend Gowan Pamphlet, the Baptist preacher who led enslaved and free African Americans in worship here in Williamsburg in the 1770s. That would later become the historic First Baptist Church in Williamsburg. In my conversation with him after the lecture, he felt strongly that the lasting efforts of the Great Awakening, led by preachers such as Presbyterian Samuel Davies, inspired the colonists to break from Britain and create their own nation. The Great Awakening was a movement toward a more personal, individual faith, instead of the institutional membership of the Church of England. I have not seen it yet, but I understand that the movie that's out, A Great Awakening, the story of a relationship between John Whitfield and Benjamin Franklin, is very well done. But put that on your list if you want to know a little bit more of the Great Awakening. That was several decades before the Revolution, however. The Great Awakening, John Ragosta writes that the Great Awakening was a powerful force for growth in evangelical religion, and certainly the tenets and structure of evangelical denominations emphasized the claims of individual conscience and helped plant democratic principles among the populace. I believe that the Great Awakening as well, with its fervor, and the Scottish Enlightenment, with its philosophy, both played a significant part in the Revolution and preached by the colonial clergy, many who were Presbyterian. The most influential Presbyterian clergyman of the Revolution was undoubtedly John Witherspoon, the only clergyman to sign the Declaration of Independence. Witherspoon was born in 1723 in Yester, Scotland, the son of a Presbyterian minister. There's that predestination thing again. He was a graduate of the University of Edinburgh, where I was able to go and visit and see a plaque in his honor on the New School of Edinburgh. And at the urging of Benjamin Rush, Richard Stockton, Witherspoon finally accepted in 1768 their renewed invitation. He turned them down in 1766 to become president and head professor of the Presbyterian College of New Jersey in Princeton. At the age of 45, he became the 6th president of the college, later known as Princeton University. He would teach one president, James Madison, one vice president, Aaron Burr, 49 U.S. representatives, 28 U.S. senators, 3 Supreme Court justices, 1 Secretary of State, and 3 attorneys general. More than 11% of Witherspoon's graduates would become college presidents in 8 different American states. Quite the influence. According to Reverend Jonathan Odell, the old cause of Witherspoon's Presbyterian faith was apparently rooted in the hate of kings and the glory of the kirk. A Scottish Presbyterian heritage was bound to have attracted Witherspoon to the American revolt against London. End quote. And as you may know, the Presbyterians and the Scottish were always trying to revolt against England whenever they could. Gideon Mailer, in his book, John Witherspoon's American Revolution, writes that many Loyalists and Anglicans asserted that Presbyterianism was central to the Patriot movement, noting that Horace Walpole, who upon hearing of the American Revolution's latest extraordinary proceedings, is said to have risen from his seat in the British House of Commons and to have summarized coolly, "Cousin America has run off with a Presbyterian parson." Mailer writes, Witherspoon's evangelicalism was indeed transferred from his educational sphere to the public forums of the Revolutionary era, deriving in part from a Presbyterian gerrymad tradition. His revolutionary political theology appealed to colonists. These colonists formed an important yet somewhat overlooked audience for Witherspoon's patriotic preaching, particularly when examining the content, tone, and reception of his most famous May 1776 sermon entitled "The Dominion of Providence over the Passions of Men." The text came to be read by Presbyterians as far south as Georgia and as far north as Maine, before then reaching Witherspoon's former colleagues on the eastern side of the Atlantic. Witherspoon's revolutionary political theology adds a Scottish inflection to the post-Puritan paradigm of Congregational and Baptist patriot discourse. Assessing his Presbyterian voice uncovers aspects of patriot thought that were distinct to the Scottish Calvinist influence. End quote. That sermon, which was preached 6 weeks before he signed the Declaration of Independence, examines the role of divine providence in the revolutionary struggle. In 1777, Witherspoon was elected to the Continental Congress as a delegate from New Jersey and served until November 1784, 7 years. He served on 100 committees of the Congress, helped to draft the Articles of Confederation. In his book, John Witherspoon and the Founding of the American Republic, Jeffrey Morrison refers to Witherspoon as the forgotten founder. He writes, perhaps more than any other single founder, Witherspoon embodied all of the major intellectual and social elements behind the American founding. Witherspoon was literally peerless among his founding brothers when it came to combining religion, education, and politics. And seldom in American history have so many key vocations been joined in one man. The most informative book that I studied was Pulpit and Nation, Clergymen and the Politics of Revolutionary America by Spencer W. McBride. He notes that the role and relationship of religion and politics has been debated from the very beginning of our country, and that there has never been a consensus. Yet from the beginning of the Revolution, Congress explicitly encouraged clergy to preach national politics from their pulpits. The clergy played a role of essential intermediaries between the would-be national leaders and the average Americans. McBride believes that without these influential clergy, the first constitutionally elected leaders would have been hard-pressed to persuade Americans to join in the fight, end quote. McBride points to the Declaration of National Fast Days, my first point, first declared by Thomas Jefferson in 1774, and the first from the Continental Congress in 1775 by John Adams. So there was declared a national fasting day. McBride writes, by proclaiming fast days, Congress was inviting American clergy to engage with the public on a national campaign to forge a sense of unity, end quote. These fast days did give clergy some opportunity to preach about politics and also gain support from their Congress members. McBride said, however, fast days did not make Americans more committed to theological beliefs. Clergy in the 1780s and 1790s complained that religious life in America was weakening. By using religious language that resonated with Americans of multiple religious denominations, fast days helped to move the country to accept a more religiously neutral space for public participation in shaping a national sense of belonging. Rather than zealously promoting religious doctrines or faith, Congress used providential language and fast days to alter the British language of empire to meet the needs of a young American nation, end quote. McBride also looked at the role of chaplains in the Continental Army and also chaplains with the Congress. He said the Army chaplains' main role in the British Army was to prepare men to face death and bolster their courage. In addition to these duties, several congressional delegates and military officers expected American chaplains to work as agents of moral reform in turning the Continental Army into a professional force and urged them to further project to the soldiers this idea that the new American army was the modern army of Israel. But perhaps most importantly, revolutionary leaders expected chaplains to shoulder a large part of the burden of keeping Americans in the war. Desertion was a serious problem with volunteers leaving to go back home. During the war, the rate was between 20 and 25%. John Adams and General Nathaniel Greene encouraged chaplains to focus their sermons on oath-keeping. Quote, if in their sermons, the Army's chaplains would depict oath-keeping as a sign of manliness and true Christianity, then Adams and Greene believed that soldiers would subsequently equate desertion with cowardice and sin. Such sermons would motivate American soldiers to stay in the Army not just for the sake of their country, but for the sake of their own souls, end quote. McBride said also, on the other side, soldiers had very high expectations of their chaplains. They expected their chaplains to be eloquent, inspiring, and entertaining orators. They complained when chaplains read their sermons with no emotion. On one occasion, Reverend William Tennant preached a 3-hour sermon to his regiments in an animated and demonstrative style that held the listeners' attention and left them holding a profound silence for more than a minute after he was done. 3 hours. General Washington, unfortunately, was disgusted by the profanity and the gambling of the troops. And George Washington petitioned Congress for more chaplains and required worship to help cure these vices in the soldiers. He wanted more chaplains to help clean up the troops, the behavior of the troops. Now, the Continental Congress also had clergy who were invited to be chaplains. McBride notes that when the First Continental Congress met in 1774, they did not open with prayer. However, prayer was one of their first debates. John Adams recalled, quote, Mr. Thomas Cushing made a motion that Congress should be opened with prayer. It was opposed by Mr. Joy of New York, and Mr. Rutledge of South Carolina, because we were so divided in religious sentiments, so that we could not join in the same act of worship, end quote. Samuel Adams then spoke, asserting that he was, quote, no bigot, and would hear a prayer from a gentleman of piety and virtue who was at the same time a friend of his country, end quote. Adams suggested Jacob Duché, the Anglican rector of Philadelphia's Christ Church, who had the distinction of offering the very first prayer in Congress. Duché began with the Anglican Collect, designated for September 7th, from the Book of Common Prayer, which began with Psalm 35. Then, to their surprise, especially for an Anglican, he began to pray He beseeched God to look down in mercy on these American states, who have fled to thee from the rod of the oppressor, and to thee have they appealed for the righteousness of their cause. He prayed God to direct the counsels of this honorable assembly, to shower down on them the millions they represented, such temporal blessings as thou seest expedient for them in this world, and crown them with everlasting glory for the world to come. As for the British, he asked that God to defeat the malicious designs of our cruel adversaries and convince them of the unrighteousness of their cause, that they may no longer persist in their sanguinary purposes. John Adams wrote that the prayer filled the bosom of every man present, that he had never heard a better prayer or one so well pronounced. They asked Duché to serve as the official chaplain. Duché resigned in 1776, citing health issues, and in December of 1776, Congress passed a motion to appoint 2 chaplains instead of 1. A week later, the delegates elected Reverend Patrick Allison, a Presbyterian minister, and Reverend William White, an Anglican. White accepted, but Allison declined, and another Presbyterian, Reverend George Duffield, was appointed. They chose 2 chaplains to symbolize their own multi-denominational composition, with the hopes of preserving the unity among the people. Also, delegates would regularly worship at denominations not their own to promote inclusion and unity. An interesting Presbyterian attestation to this was in May 1775, when the Presbyterian Synod of New York and Philadelphia advised that the congregations under its governance, that in order to, quote, preserve the union which at present subsists throughout all the colonies, a spirit of candor, charity, and mutual esteem should be preserved and promoted toward those of different religious denominations, end quote. That's pretty Presbyterian. The Continental Congress then turned to daily prayer in its political ritual. The purpose for the prayer before the meetings was to promote civil discourse, to reinforce the revolution's religious symbolism, and urge greater unity among the colonists. McBride saw the clergy taking advantage of this situation as well, wanting to get an inside track and believing this would help them reestablish the importance of the church in a society where the social elites were deists. Religious enthusiasm was waning after more than 2 decades removal from the zeal of the Great Awakening. By formally inviting clergy to participate in the creation and maintenance of the American Army, Congress sanctioned a place for them on a new national political stage. Yet, in this prominent place, the national leaders valued them for their pragmatic and symbolic role, and not necessarily for their Christian theologies they espoused. In regard to the relationship of religion and politics, McBride comments, in this movement, we see the emergence of a peculiar and enduring pattern in American political culture. When secular factions believe clergy are on their side, They championed their participation in political processes as legitimate and even essential. But when the tables are turned, the same factions declare clerical participation in politics as an unholy alliance between church and state. McBride tackles what he calls the myth of the Christian president in chapter 6 of his book. He traces this assumption back to the contested presidential elections of 1796 and again in 1800. Federalist politicians and their clerical allies aimed an onslaught of defamatory rhetoric at Thomas Jefferson for his deist views. They argued that only Christians should occupy the office of the presidency, consciously disregarding the Constitution's explicit statement that persons' religious disposition should not disqualify them from holding public office. Many Federalist clergy campaigning against Jefferson were motivated by a genuine concern over the deterioration of American religious life. Both elections between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, both of those elections were between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. William Smith, in one of his contentious pamphlets, portrayed Jefferson as a godless philosopher whose aims were to replace religious worship with Enlightenment rationalism and to turn Christian churches into temples of the supreme being. McBride quotes a freeholder from James City County who argued that no man ought to be president who does not profess and practice the Christian religion. Well, the Republicans fought back. DeWitt Clinton insisted that we have the strongest reasons to believe that Jefferson is a real Christian. But most Republicans did not focus on Jefferson's faith, but instead criticized Federalists for making religion an election issue in the first place. Jonathan Russell argued, a public office holder is answerable to society for his actions only. For his faith, we will trust him with his God. Adams believed both parties had acted dishonorably, and that the important issues in the election were ignored in favor of this party-generated hysteria. Jefferson clearly states how he wanted to be represented in terms of religiosity. He said, "Say nothing about my religion. It is known to my God and myself alone. Its evidence before the world is to be sought in my life. If that has been honest and dutiful to society, the religion which has regulated it cannot be a bad one." End quote. Later, McBride says that later generations of Americans crystallized this myth of an American political culture with skewed retellings of the nation's founding era. And this is the legacy of this contentious elections of 1796 and 1800, the myth of the Christian president. John A. Ragasta shines a spotlight on the clergy in Virginia, particularly, and how they impacted the fight for liberty in his book, Wellspring of Liberty, How Virginia's Religious Dissenters Helped Win the American Revolution and Secured Religious Liberty. He writes, for 200 years, sectarian histories have related how Virginia's dissenters, Baptists and Presbyterians, were fighting for freedom during the Revolutionary War. And so they were. But the fight was not simply a fight against Britain. It was equally a fight with the Virginia establishment. They fought both for freedom for religion and freedom from British rule. The two were intimately linked, not simply in a theoretical or principled sense, but in a very practical sense. They would not have mobilized for the latter without provision of the former. The immediate, albeit far-reaching result of the negotiations between dissenters and the establishment was that Virginia witnessed the development of religious freedom and an understanding of that freedom which still speaks loudly today. Equally important in the process of that negotiation, Virginia was changed. The establishment gentry were forced to incorporate a broader population, dissenting, Western, middling, and lower class, into Virginia polity. Our sense of religious freedom was largely developed in Virginia precisely because this negotiation between these dissenters occurred. And at the same time, Virginia was changed. The policy expanded, and dissenters were able to join the civil community, end quote. In colonial Virginia, as many of you know, the Church of England was designated as the established church of the colony. That meant the church and the state were very closely aligned. The vestry assessment, the assessment for the Anglican Church, or Church of England, was a taxation without representation for religious dissenters. And that tax was usually the highest tax paid by 18th century Virginians. There was also a law that required dissenting ministers to swear an oath to the king, accept the articles of the Anglican faith, and be licensed. As interpreted by the local gentry in Virginia, both ministers and places of worship, both of them had to be licensed. And they had to be licensed in the general court in Williamsburg, which only met twice a year, requiring a considerable trip for Piedmont, Shenandoah Valley ministers in the period well before maintained roads. So dissenting clergy were also often fined for not attending Anglican church and could be arrested and jailed for preaching without a license. From 1768 to 1778, more than 50 dissenters were jailed for preaching without a license, and many of them for extended periods. He goes through, he has lists them in his, Regasta in his book, all of the clergy, how they were arrested, where they were, and how long they had to stay to serve. In 1776, it was estimated that 22% of the white population in Virginia were dissenters. Presbyterians made up a large group of Virginia dissenters, made up of Scotch-Irish immigrants, filling the Shenandoah Valley from Pennsylvania and spreading down the Blue Ridge into the Piedmont. It's estimated that by the time of the Revolution, there were over 90 Presbyterian meeting houses in Virginia and approximately 70 Presbyterian ministers. In addition, Baptists faced very serious physical assault and incarceration from the latter part of the 1760s until the wars. In other cases, Baptist preachers were dunked, almost drowned, in mockery of their belief in immersion baptism. One story was told that on the first preaching of a Baptist in these parts, met with violent opposition, a mob collected at one of their meetings, seized the preacher, Borrow, and Mince, carried them to the water not too far distant. They dipped them several times, holding them under the water until they nearly drowned, asking them if they believed. At length, Mr. Barrow replied, "I believe you mean to drown me." After sporting with them thus, they let them go. In 1776, after some losses by the Continental Army, particularly the defeats of George Washington in and around New York, there were grave concerns about recruiting forces for the army. Regasta writes, Baptists insisted on an end of establishment taxes and restrictions on dissenters' worship and marriages, especially linking their support for the war to these freedoms. This is what the Baptists said. These things granted, we will gladly unite with our brethren of other denominations and to the utmost of our ability promote the common cause of freedom. He notes that Hanover Presbytery had a very specific request for religious freedom, stating, "In a land where all of every denomination are united in this most strenuous effort to be free, we hope and expect that our representatives will cheerfully concur in removing every species of religious as well as civil bondage." The Presbyterians concluded that this being done, it will inure the great honor and interest of the state. Regasta writes, in fact, beyond personal service, Virginia's political establishment probably saw the most useful role for dissenting clergy in encouraging its congregants to support the war. Community leader support of the establishment and provision of material support were central to Virginia's ability to mobilize, and dissenting ministers' role in the community were increasing with the size of their congregations. There's some indication that precisely this support is what the establishment leaders were seeking as they negotiated liberalized restrictions on religious liberty. Edmund Randolph, for example, noted that the dissenting minister's style of preaching and experience in public exhortation particularly suited them to recruiting. He said, the Presbyterian clergy were indefatigable, not depending on dead letters of written sermons. They understood the mechanism of haranguing and had often been wedded in disputes on religious liberty so nearly allied with the civil. So these negotiations between the dissenters and the establishment of Virginia resulted in bringing about religious freedom in Virginia and an end to the establishment church. With a proposal for a general assessment rejected, the dissenters, with the assistance of James Madison's legislative skills, turned to a permanent end of the establishment and the adoption of Jefferson's statute for establishing religious freedom, codifying the religious freedom that dissenters had long sought. While before the Revolution, no colony more carefully protected its established church more aggressively, and more aggressively discriminated against its and persecuted dissenters than Virginia. But by early 1786, with the adoption of the statute, no state provided broader protections to religious freedom or did so in eloquent as terms. I was at a conference in Richmond, and we were going out to dinner, and I walked by and saw this monument. And this is a monument to the statute for establishing religious freedom. It's on 14th Street, and it's also exactly where this statute was established and ratified. There is the Valentine Museum of Religious Freedom that is right behind there. It's by appointment only, but you can look it up and go and take a tour of religious freedom. So this, I will read to you this statement. Jefferson's bill passed into law in Virginia on January 19, 1786, and reads, that no man shall be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship, place, or ministry whatsoever, nor shall be enforced, restrained, molested, or burdened in his body or goods, nor shall otherwise suffer on account of his religious opinions or belief, but that all men shall be free to profess and by argument to maintain their opinions in matters of religion, and that the same shall in no wise diminish, enlarge, or affect their civil capabilities. Ragasta believes that this was the precedent of religious freedom bill, that the work of James Madison from Virginia laid the foundation for the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution in 1791, the freedom of religion and the separation of church and state. Well, let me share with you a final thought from McBride. I know this is too little to read, but I'm going to read it for you. We can credit the founders, then, with initiating and enduring, with the enduring American tradition of mixing religion and politics, while simultaneously debating the proper balance of the two. But why do 21st century Americans care so deeply about the role religion played in the political processes that created the United States? Can all the heated arguments over the issue really be about finding the, quote, correct or intended degree of separation of church and state? Surely the crux of the issue lies deeper than a fight over if and when political leaders can pray publicly or comment on religious-based morals. Indeed, the issue's full historical context tells us that there is much more to the equation than simple pragmatic questions of the proper role of religion should play in a country's political sphere. The clamor and passion 21st century Americans exhibit in their public debate over the relationship of religion to politics during the nation's founding era is indicative of a far more personal internal conflict. At its core, it is an issue of identity. For better or for worse, our identity is tied up with the past. Well, thank you so much for listening. So as we celebrate our nation's 250th anniversary, let us also give thanks to those faithful clergy who believed that living in a free country was a God-given right. Thank you so much.